Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for the Turok Remaster on the Xbox Series X. They've released an update, the next-gen update for this game, which sort of updates the controls to more similarly match a lot of the controls they've been using for their recent titles. And I'm going to try to relook at Turok 2 to demonstrate what it looked like beforehand. Turok 1 and 2 had the same controls as far as I could tell, so that'll be a more direct comparison. One other thing to preface this on is the default dead zones are not accessible once you change this. So the default left stick dead zone was 24% and the right stick was 26.5%. And this slider increments in 5%. So once you change it, you can't get back to this. 25% isn't really going to make a difference on the graph, but that's just a heads up there that these graphs were made with the original values, but you can't quite access them anymore. But getting into it, for movement, the dead zone is actually a little larger than what the option says, but it's a circular-esque shape, but it kind of moves to corners, except there's a small divot in these corners. These blue regions represent ranges of cardinal movement, so if I'm within them right here, I'm moving perfectly to the right, I'm moving perfectly forward, and perfectly backward. This doesn't appear to be scaled, meaning that if you move, I'm going to align myself so that the crosshair is relatively centered to this, and you can see that if I move within this region, I'm perfectly aligned with this, but if I move outside into this green region, you start seeing diagonal movement occur. And if we're paying attention to the horizontal movements, you can see that I'm sliding to the right now left. And you can see that it's a little abrupt. This will be more clear with the different dead zone sizes, but it not being scaled means that any angles within this region are completely lost. They're not rescaled to the screen region, so subtle angles within these regions are inaccessible. The dotted line represents the move sensitivity. The move sensitivity changes the curve of your movement. I can't really demonstrate it clearly. It changes how fast your movement curve is, but there's no real way to accurately compare it. So the gradient from your slowest movements to your full speed movements changes with this, and the move sensitivity controls that, as well as actually the dead zone does change the curve too. But the movement sensitivity at default is 4. At minimum, it's 0, and that's what the dash threshold reflects. If you put it to 0, the dead zone increases slightly, and it also increases the restriction right near the dead zone, though it does blend together. And if the move sensitivity is 8, which is the maximum, that can slightly decrease the dead zone, but in this case it's identical to it at 4. But the curve does slow down. I'll just show the curves on screen because it's a little difficult to actually demonstrate them as they are, just with moving. But moving to the camera, we have a 25% dead zone because that's the option, but this graph is showing the 26.5%, but it's pretty close. But we can see it's a perfect circle. And we can see that there is restriction around here, just a slightly different shape. And you don't start seeing diagonal movement until you break into these green regions. And here, this is unscaled as well, so the transitions are pretty abrupt. And this is most obvious when capping the view like this. You can see that once I move into the screen region, that horizontal movement begins very abruptly. The curve starts out as a sort of shallow exponential, and it starts slower and then builds up until it hits this acceleration jump, and then there's a slight increase until it caps out. This curve does change with the dead zone size, as we'll see in just a little bit. So here, the movement dead zone is again larger than the option states, and you can see this cleft in the corners a little more clearly. But the restriction has increased dramatically, so you can see that I can make these huge bogging motions, and in this case I'm moving perfectly right and left, perfectly forward, perfectly backward. If we, again, line ourselves up so that the crosshair is relatively centered, you can see that once we break into these green regions, diagonal movement is quite abrupt. And that again is because the angles aren't being scaled, so we're losing all these subtle angles, and instead it just pivots to a dramatic angle instead. In this case, there is no dashed or dotted line visible. At this dead zone size, it seemed like all the movement sensitivity values align perfectly with each other, so it was just all the same dead zone size, though the curves do change with the movement sensitivity values the same as they would normally. For the camera, we have a 50% perfectly circular dead zone. And the restriction has also significantly increased here as well, so you can see that I can make these large bobbing motions and I'm moving perfectly left. But once I break out of the axial dead zone, you can see a pretty abrupt pivot. And again, capping the view up and down like this is the easiest way to see this, and you can see that transition is very abrupt. The curve, again, is different with this dead zone size. It starts slower, it's more exponential than it was at the default dead zone size, and it also pushes this acceleration jump threshold outward, so it's much closer to the edge of stick movement. And then once you hit the acceleration jump, there's a tiny bit of stick movement left to max out the turn speed. So the movement dead zone is it's larger than the 5% that's mentioned, but it is a little too difficult to show clearly in the video at this size. I will provide a zoomed in demonstration at the test points, because this is where you can really see the difference between the movement sensitivity tests. So again, the dashed lines are the movement sensitivity at 0, the solid lines are at 4, and the dotted lines are at 8. So it changes the dead zone a little more dramatically at the minimum. But the angular restriction is very limited at this point, and we can see that as I'm using the middle structure to demonstrate this, and you can see that just moving right outside of these actual regions, I can move much more subtly diagonally than you could with the previous dead zone sizes, and that's because you have more angles available than at those other sizes. You still lose some because there's some restriction here, but it's very limited compared to the other dead zone sizes. The movement, or I mean, the camera dead zone is 5% perfectly circular dead zone. And again, the restriction is very limited at this. It might even be difficult to see clearly from this vertical axis. But again, we can look straight up and down. You can see that there's a slight range here, but you can see how much slower the diagonal movement starts. It is still being cropped slightly, so it is starting faster than it should. But because it's not as wide, even it being unscaled is still giving us much more subtle diagonals than we had at those other dead zone sizes. So the curve again changes with this dead zone size, and it starts slightly slower but then builds up much faster than the others, and then begins tapering off the further you push. And it also pulls in this acceleration jump, so this happens much earlier. And then it makes that jump and then continues tapering until its maximum turn speed. So overall, the movement is a little different than Nightdive's previous titles, though the issues with them still remain. Basically, the dead zone directly affects the curve as well as the restricted diagonal movement. The larger you make the dead zone, the slower the acceleration curve is, which can make that quite a bit more controllable. However, you lose access to subtle diagonals the larger the dead zone. Making the dead zone smaller gives you more diagonal movement, but makes the curve less controllable. So there's a trade-off there. Despite that issue, this is actually a huge improvement over the original controls for this, and what I'll demonstrate right now in Turok 2. Alright, so we're in Turok 2. This is going to be how the Turok 1 remaster controlled before this next-gen update, and how currently this Turok 2 remaster still plays. I imagine they are going to probably update this version 2 at some point, but looking at the movement, we can see here that it has a very large, what I've been sort of calling a bloated square dead zone. And like demonstrated in Turok 1 Remastered, there's restricted diagonal movement here, and it's more restricted right around the dead zones. But similarly, this is not scaled, so when you break into these green regions, you begin moving diagonally pretty abruptly, and that's especially obvious the closer to the dead zone. For the curve, the movement curve is actually different, so we still have the same move sensitivity slider, but this doesn't change the curve really. It does, but this is actually a multiplier, so at default This axial restriction, these dead zones are made by a radial dead zone being underneath and then applying an axial dead zone on top of this. So there's a 25% axial dead zone on a 24% radial dead zone. And what that does is what that means is when you break out of this dead zone and the actual dead zone is unscaled, the movement curve is scaled to that 24% radial dead zone. So when you break out of this central dead zone, you start at 25% of your total movement speed, and then there's a smooth gradient until your maximum movement speed. However, if we say raise this to let's do its maximum, you can see that once we break out of the dead zone, we instantly move at our maximum movement speed. There is no difference in speed between our stick movements. And what it's doing is it's a multiplier. So this is just saying that this is multiplying our movement speed curve by 5. But since our lowest starting movement speed is 25, that times 5 is 125, and that's already exceeding 100% of your movement speed. So it's capping the movement speed at that the instant we move outside of the dead zone. Whereas if we say put this down to 10%, we still exiting, and we technically have 25% of 10% of our total speed, but you can see that now our maximum speed is 10% of the default movement speed. So this is just a multiplier for your movement speed. If it goes over 1, it functionally creates an outer dead zone, where once it exceeds your maximum movement speed, it just stops, and if it goes under it, you actually just slow down. But the camera is almost exactly the same. It has the same axial dead zone, so 25%, built on top of a 26.5% radial dead zone underneath. And the same restriction is present here, so and a little even more obvious, just because it's a little easier to see with camera movements. So I can make all these movements within this axial region, and I'm moving perfectly to the right. But as soon as I break out into this green region, you see very obvious angular changes, because this is simply not scaled, so we're jumping, or we're losing every angle in these ranges. And I'll cap the view like this to demonstrate this more clearly. We're losing all of these subtle angles, and once we break out of this, we're getting very dramatic angles out. So we have a very heavily restricted dead zone, and this implementation makes it so that it's most restricted right outside the dead zone. So very small movements feel the most restricted. It feels like you almost have 4 to 8 directions to work with. So the curve in this case is like exactly similarly to movement, starts at 25% of your total turn speed and then increases linearly until your maximum turn rate. So again, this curve is being scaled to this underlying radial dead zone, and it's being cropped by the axial dead zone on top. And this makes it so that really you can't make precise adjustments. You start at 25% of your total speed, and you can see I'm of course playing at the maximum sensitivity right now, so it's, and this isn't even really all that fast of a sensitivity, but you can see that if I was trying to make precise adjustments, it's really just sloppy. And this is why in my previous video I was saying that you might even want to use some level of smoothing, because smoothing forces your turn speed to start out lower. So even though it starts out at 25%, you could still make precise adjustments. Of course, this makes general aiming and tracking feel very sluggish and unresponsive. So that's not an ideal solution, but that's really the best we had with this current control implementation. Now, this game introduced the radial wheels, and these have, of course, dead zones to them. So we will look at this. So the two weapon wheels have the same dead zone, so we can see that the dead zone itself is actually the same as the camera, at least the central dead zone. But in the general shape is the same up until this point, but there's extra angular restriction to create a wider division. So you can see that up here are the blade, and then the bow gets this entire range, and then the pistols get this entire range. So now the dead zone shaped a little weird, of course, but the actual ranges you're going to be really looking at are the full tilt from here to here, here to here, here to here, and so on. And these are relatively equidistant, so this isn't a bad implementation for its purpose. The only thing that would seem kind of weird, though I actually haven't had an issue with it, is if, say, you move the stick like this, and when resetting, like if it skipped over here, and then you released and got an adjacent cardinal direction weapon rather than the diagonal weapon you wanted. But I've never really had that happen, so either there's some kind of slight buffering to keep the selection selected for a short period. Either way, it hasn't been an issue, so I think the wheel works fine, even though the shape is a little strange. And of course, both wheels function the same. Now, of course, there's more weapons in this, and there's actually weapons you can select underwater, and that has its own dead zone because there's only 3 to select. This graph looks a little funky. I just used the stripes to differentiate another selection. Nothing special about that. But we can see that the selection is about the same. You can see that there's an extra angular restriction here, though the general central shape is the same. It's some errors, so that doesn't pop up. So this entire region is dedicated to top selection, and what's interesting is this bottom selection is wider, and that's a pretty interesting byproduct of just the inequality sign.
Your oxygen is low.
And that's because if you looked at the previous dead zone, like this whole range right here was blue, so axial restriction, and what that does is set the horizontal values to 0. When you're setting up something like this, where you're doing
Your oxygen is low.
doing that, you have to say like anything greater than 0 is do this, anything under 0 do that, or well, greater than or equal to 0. And what they've done here is to say anything less than or equal to 0 is this whole range, which ends up including this entire range, because all of this would be considered 0, so all of that's included. So just a sort of interesting shape for this implementation. Of course, there's only 3 weapons, and each have massive ranges, so this wouldn't be noticeable at all. You can't really mess this up. But just interesting how that these axial dead zones can widen ranges just for that reason. But oops, that was not right. Anyway, so that it about covers Turok 2. So this and the original version of the first Turok Remaster were very unpleasant to play, simply because you really had no precise control over your camera. So aiming was very sloppy, and that's something that, despite the modern or the current Nightdive implementation, despite the problems with that, it's still vastly superior simply because you can make precise adjustments. Of course, the default dead zone at 26.5% is much smaller than the 40% we see here, but being able to make movements smaller than 25% of your total speed definitely alone is dramatically better. Now, one thing that it's really difficult to know because what's under this axial dead zone isn't clear is these dead zones are created by setting up a radial dead zone and then an axial dead zone on top of this. A fix for this, assuming there wasn't any additional restriction under this, would simply be to remove this axial dead zone. Then you'd have, even in the original release of these remasters, if you didn't have the axial dead zone, what you'd have, at least for the camera, is a 26.5 perfect radial dead zone with full diagonal movement with a linear curve, and that would be pretty normal. And then adding dead zone options to it, would give you full diagonal movement with a radial dead zone with a linear curve. Now, I don't know when this issue with Nightdive's titles started, where the dead zone controlled the curve and all that. So that could have been present at the point of the original Turok remasters. But at least based on the way these dead zones are set up, that seems like that shouldn't have been an issue. It seems to have popped up around Quake's first update, because Quake's curve was a little different than what the update had created, and maybe that was a reason, but maybe that issue predates that. So it's the next-gen update is certainly a dramatic improvement, but not as ideal as it could be. And I think that it's a case of a few steps forward and still one step backwards, or just a lateral move, not quite where it should be, because movement is less restricted now, but there's still a lot of restriction. But otherwise, I've rambled enough, but we can see that the next gen update is dramatically better than what these games originally got, but there is still much more room for improvement. The last thing I just want to put 2 cents in, because I can't cover it, is I did test the Thing from Nightdive, and it's pretty standard. It has the same exact controls pretty much from the previous games. It's just I can't effectively test the vertical axial dead zones for movement. There's just something with some third-person games where that's difficult. But you can see that that's all. I'm just going to show all the graphs on screen, and that's just the case there. So it's their current standard, and it's better than what these Turok remakes had originally had, and hopefully Turok 2 gets updated with that improvement as well. But hopefully they can actually find where the issue is with their current implementation and get rid of it, because get rid of it and make things work ideally, because they're giving great options. We have dead zone options and all that. In Quake games we had even curve options, so the options are there. It's just the implementation still not quite where it could be. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and everyone have a great rest of your day.